It's great to be here. It's great to see people in the room focused on a question that we usually kind of keep to the side. I'll explain, well, we'll both explain some of the issues that are there. How do we make something that's iffy and then really important stay on a front burner? And I've been writing about this as a journalist now on the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, 2004, earthquakes all around the world, global warming and climate-related hazards for 30 years. And they all have this similar pattern. And I did a blog post when I was at the New York Times. I wrote regular stories, and I also developed a blog. The blog was actually developed partially because this is a hard thing to convey in a sustained way. Yeah. A reader posted this line. This gets to that argument thing this session a minute ago. You know, how do you foster good conversations? He said, "Are we stuck with blah, 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 bang?" That's his phrase. And then I wrote another piece with that phrase, and that phrase keeps coming up. Blah, 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 bang. And so Brock Long, who's now not capping, but has moved in an 18-year career in emergency management to the top of the heap, you know, directing the Federal Emergency Management Agency, right? Yep. And the hot seat he took 1 year ago. This week. And a whole bunch of stuff happened right away. Yeah. So you had some initiating thoughts you wanted to get out. So why don't you kind of dive into that, and then I'll.
Well, first of all, Andy, thank you, and thanks for everybody sitting here. I mean, I know there are a ton of great speakers that are here this week, so I'm honored that you would sit here and listen to what I've got to say, because honestly, I want to recruit you. We've got a lot of work to do in this country when it comes to building a true culture of preparedness, which I'll get to here in a minute. But unfortunately, I've had an amazing career in emergency management, and in my career, I've actually stumbled into it, Andy. I stumbled into it as a graduate intern from Appalachian State University in North Carolina, where I grew up, and have had some amazing opportunities, been blessed with amazing opportunities pushing forward. But it's interesting. One thing that I've learned is that every time I change jobs, something catastrophic happens. So, I started.
By the way, I'm really glad that one didn't happen right now, so that you're here.
Exactly, right. But, I started my career in school and university safety because Georgia ranked #1 in the most violent deaths in schools, and this was all before Columbine occurred. I was hired to go in and help build a school safety program, which we could talk about later down the road, too. My first day on the job with Georgia Emergency Management Agency was the evacuation for Hurricane Floyd in 1999, the nation's largest evacuation from Florida to basically Delaware. At any given time, one of those states, they were issuing evacuations. I interviewed with FEMA the first time on the morning of 9/11. That's where I was when 9/11 occurred. And I became Hurricane Program Manager, largely in charge of evacuation planning and operational teams down at the National Hurricane Center in 2004. So if you remember that year, I think you remember it, there were 4 major hurricanes in 6 weeks. So you had Charlie, Francis, Jeanne, and Ivan. And then the next year you had Katrina. And I got to see the agency at its best in 2004, because when FEMA's doing really well, we don't make the news, which is truly unfortunate about the 21,000 people that dedicate their lives to serving you and others. We just don't make the news if everything goes right. The next year, you find out as an agency you're only as good as your weakest link in your last disaster in 2005. And it goes from being one of the best agencies to automatically one of the worst agencies to work at. I was then appointed by the Governor Bob Riley in Alabama to be Alabama's Emergency Management Agency Director. And while I was there, I got Deepwater Horizon, so we could talk about that.
So this is all your fault, is what you're saying.
And then this year, we've had an unprecedented year. The agency has truly been taxed. And to put this into context, it's not just Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, and the California wildfires. 35 states. FEMA was working in 35 states this year, 4 tribal territories, and we were stretched from American Samoa to the Virgin Islands. I have staff in American Samoa. I have them in Alaska. I have them in Hawaii working a volcano. Apparently it's volcano season, not just hurricane season. That's a joke. To Texas all the way to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And the question is, what do you want FEMA to be good at? Okay? We should never be a first responder. We should never be the primary responder in any given situation. And what I mean by that is we all have to strive in this country to go for a model that emergency management, mitigation and preparedness to response and recovery is locally executed, state managed, federally supported, okay? That's the model that works best. You saw that play out with California. The politics couldn't be polar opposite between DC and California. But how many times did FEMA get beat up over the worst urban wildfires that have hit the country or the globe? Thousands of people had their homes burned to the ground, and we barely make the news about it. It was a $2 billion event. People are really struggling from that. But you hear nothing about it because the local communities, the state, truly embody that model of locally executed emergency management, state-supported, or state-managed, federally supported, and that's what works. When it's flipped over, it's never going to go as anybody would like to see it. So if you take Puerto Rico, and we can break down Puerto Rico a little bit more, but the bottom line is emergency management is almost like a stool with 4 legs. There's the federal government, the state government, the local government, and then there's you. There's you, the private industry. The private industry and the NGOs are the most powerful leg of that. But if any one of those legs in a disaster is gone, then that stool becomes less stable. Well, in the case of Puerto Rico, there were 3 stool legs that were missing in that part, which we can go into, which made it an incredibly complex event. But Andy, the one thing that we're trying to do is not only did we register more people to receive individual assistance from FEMA in the last 9 months, we registered over 5.5 million people to receive assistance from FEMA in the last 9 months. That's the same that the agency did over the previous decade combined. We shoved 10 years into 9 months. That's how unprecedented this last year was. So with that, I believe in building unity of effort. I believe in getting buy-in, and it can't just be a strategic plan. If we can pull the strategic plan up, if it's not showing there. We created buy-in. We went out to our constituents, we went out to citizens. I went through my staff and said, where's FEMA? Where do you want FEMA to be? How do we get there? Is this a legislative change? Is this, you need a better copier on the 8th floor to get work done? I don't know what it was gonna be, but I wanted to hear. So we got 2,300 comments back. We run a trend analysis, and we come up with 3 very simple but ambitious goals, and you guys fit into this, all right? We got to create a true culture of preparedness in this country that does not exist. We're nowhere close to being prepared. 2, we've got to do a lot more work to ready the nation for catastrophic disasters, particularly the earthquakes, the low to no notice events. I was just speaking to some folks from San Francisco, New Madrid, Cascadia, Wasatch, California, all of those faults. When they trigger and they go off, FEMA's not a first responder. We don't move at the speed of light and just drop in commodities and people out of the sky. That's not how this works. It could take us days to get forward, and what I'm trying to do is be very upfront and honest about what preparedness needs to look like when it comes to that locally executed, state-managed, federally supported model. Each community should have its own ability to run commodities such as food and water and hygiene kits in each of their local communities to a certain degree. Each state should have a robust capability. They need to be able to buy me 48 to 72 hours worth of time for specifically large-scale earthquakes, because it's hard for the federal government to move massive amounts of equipment at the speed of light if it goes off right now. So I'm in this job. I'm not here to pursue a career in Washington, D.C. I'd happily go home to North Carolina. But I am going to talk honestly about where we are in a country right now when it comes to preparedness and getting ready. The next thing is reducing complexity, Annie. We hand out billions and billions of dollars. I'm going to basically, as a result of last year, manage the distribution of $80 to $88 billion. That's how much money I deal with. During 2017, we were putting $300 million a day to work in effort to help people. We've put out $23 billion to just Harvey, Irma, Maria alone, and half of that money has already gone to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is going to get 40 or 50 billion additional dollars. Puerto Rico's never had a better opportunity than now to rebuild, be more resilient, and economically viable. But I'm not the person to tell Puerto Rico how to do it. You are. Where are the ideas? What's the system that I use that takes 40 billion bucks and says, here's what you should do with that money in the case of Puerto Rico, or several billion to rebuild the Virgin Islands? Emergency managers are never taught how to generate sales tax revenue in a community that's been devastated by storms. Okay? That's the private sector. I need those systems. I need that intelligence, Andy. But when it comes to one thing before we get going, and I want to open this back up to have a real conversation, the culture of preparedness piece bothers me the most. You are the true first responder, not your local police officer, not your local fire department, not your EMS. 1 in 4 of you is going to do CPR in your lifetime. If you haven't already, how many have already had to perform CPR? All right. The rest of you better figure out how to get first aid, okay? The other thing that's killing our country is what's called asset poverty. It's not poverty, not I don't make enough money to live in my community. That's one part of the problem that FEMA deals with. The asset poverty piece that's killing us is that 70% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So when we have ready campaigns that say, go be ready, buy 3 to 5 days worth of supplies and stockpile this, it never gets done because it's become an unrealistic financial ask.
For low-income households?
No. These are people that make 6-figure salaries that drive the right car, live in the right house. And you know what they do? They pay off their home in California, particularly those who are struggling in retirement to make ends meet. They'll pay off their home like they did in California, and then they'll let their fire insurance lapse. And then their home burns down, and then it becomes my problem. That problem is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The lack of building codes and land use planning is killing this country daily when it comes to the amount of disasters it put forward. The built environment probably causes 1/3 of the flooding that we've seen over the last year. Just the newly built environment. Because local elected officials never win elections by saying, I would love to pass building codes.
That's right.
So when it comes to the first true responder, let's talk about the statistics. The other thing that we're not doing in this country is being analytical. Let's take school shootings. Go look at the FBI statistics. Over half of the events are going to begin and end before police even get on scene. Did you know that? So how are we retraining our teachers to understand that they are the first true responder, that the likelihood of me getting on scene is not going to happen. Here's what I need you to specifically do. So do we incorporate that into our training and exercise? The riots that occur in communities because of like Baltimore and different things. What if we look at it differently? What if raising that community's collective credit score keeps that community from ever having a riot and a civil disturbance because you go from a renter to a homeowner, you now have ownership in that community? What if you got the Baltimore, the communities that rioted recently in Baltimore, that credit score collectively above 700? I bet you'd cut it all out.
So let's go into some of the details, unless there was a capping thought. No.
Got me all fired
I was
up.
holding off here, but I want to get in some thoughts. And President Trump reinforced this point after the Puerto Rico disaster, which is still unfolding. Disaster response and recovery is best achieved when it's federally supported, state managed, and locally executed. But what is the responsibility of the federal government when at the local level there is no capacity? This is the low-income communities or struggling place like Puerto Rico that's always been the short end of every stick. When does that model break down?
So first of all,
is this Congress or who?
So is it FEMA's job to make sure that infrastructure around this country is maintained? Is it? Right? So it's the whole community's responsible. I know what my responsibilities are.
Right.
But if you're going to put me in a position in your community to where you've done nothing to maintain your infrastructure, you're not properly insured, which is the most expensive expenditure FEMA has, is repairing uninsured public facilities and replacing content, which is a moral hazard.
Yeah. What's your status on? There are places where insurance, like federal disaster aid, is stuck at rebuilding to the existing norm. Let's take climate change. We're in the Hudson Valley where I live. Floyd, that same storm came through and devastated all these bridges, and they're built back to the same standard as opposed to a new standard. Right.
So now we have authorities, though, in the Robert T. Stafford Act, which guides everything that I can do. There's a section in there called Section 428 that allows me to put $40 or $50 billion into Puerto Rico and kind of run it like a business. Here's a $40 billion budget. Governor, what is your goal? What is your resilience vision right now? Instead of talking about all the political finger pointing right now, what the discussion needs to be is all of this money that comes out of your pocket as a taxpayer is going there to rebuild this community. Governor, what are your goals of a viable and economically sound Puerto Rico? And then let's grab the funding that comes not just from FEMA, but it comes from 17 different federal government agencies.
Right.
It comes from nonprofits. Tell me one governor that's ever had that kind of money put in their lap that says, all right, here's how we're going to rebuild and do the greatest good with this funding so that we never go through this ever again.
You know, I remember when Trump was running for election, there was this leaked infrastructure investment plan. And then he put out an investment plan. I kept thinking, so why isn't there integration between that and both electrical grid and resilient infrastructure could be an integrated policy that comes from the top? Why is that there?
So, but if you look at, so the president is very supportive of FEMA. And if you look at his national security strategy, and every once in a while I've been responsible for a couple tweets, okay?
Small victories. Yeah.
He's a big believer in pre-disaster mitigation, which is part of the national security strategy. And every time you hear me go before Congress, and I think I've been 10 or 11 times now, the bottom line is that we keep saying pre-disaster mitigation is the key. The only time you're going to get hit in this community right now is if you have a devastating disaster that comes through and wipes out the uninsured properties within this community, and then it triggers a numeric indicator that says federal government assistance from FEMA should be allotted here, and it comes in. And then you have to get hit to have access to massive amounts of mitigation dollars to do any good. Right. So what I'm trying to do is change that to put it up front. We need people lobbying that, and I think we're this close.
So how much of this gets back to this culture question you mentioned? For example, and this also ties together the local risk and federal costs. Headwaters Economics, which is a conservative free market think tank looking at Western issues like water and wildfire, they did a study that showed pretty clearly that you could look at federal firefighting response as a subsidy, and it's letting all these local communities off the hook, meaning that if they're not paying their fair share of that, then there's nothing in Colorado to prevent you from okaying a local development going up a mountain in a known fire zone.
So the key to disaster resilience is not FEMA, it's not the federal government, it lies at the local level. You guys have to be the ones at the local level to pass land use planning codes and building codes. That's where the key to disaster resilience is.
But shouldn't the federal government be saying, you guys got to pay some of the bill too?
Now, what we've got to be able to do, I mean, here again, it's a whole community approach. Everybody is responsible. Preparedness is everybody's responsibility from the citizen to the President of the United States, okay? We have to figure out what the appropriate amounts are. But I can tell you, for example, my general fund budget at Alabama Emergency Management Agency to be in charge of disaster response in Alabama was $7 million a year. I was spending that an hour, every hour in 2017. There's too much of a gap, and the expectations are growing unreasonable. My operational budget and my staff capacity does not grow with the number of events that we pick up. It stays where it is. I can reimburse everybody, your community to other agencies that help out, but I can't reimburse myself. So we pick up a new disaster every 3 days at FEMA, whether it's a wildfire, whether it's a tornado, or whatever it may be. We pick up a new event every 3 days. At some point, the system breaks if you continue to say FEMA's got to do better, or you need to double or triple my budget.
There was this one weird example that still haunts me. It's the what seemed to be a total bipartisan success, the Biggert Waters legislation in 2015 that resulted in rationalizing the cost of federally subsidized flood insurance, so that if you're in a flood zone, you're starting to have to pay the risk for being there. And so it was liberals and conservatives passed this in one of the most polarized Congresses ever. Obama signed it. And I think I wrote about it at the time. Yeah, wow, look at that. It can happen. And then taxpayers, Republicans and Democrats called their congressmen and said, hey, this is costing us too much money. Is this part of the culture issue or what?
So the NFIP, Congress has until the 31st of July to reauthorize the National Flood Insurance Program. I'm one of the largest insurers in the country as well. I have 5 million policy holders. I probably need 10 million. But when it comes to a flood, what the country doesn't realize is that any house can flood. I don't care. Any house you can see in here can flood if there's deferred maintenance, if storm drain systems aren't done correctly, freaks of nature, whatever it may be, any house can flood. So too many people don't have insurance. The issue with Biggert Waters is all around affordability. But my question is, going forward, it's time for the insurance industry to rethink insurance. Why can a citizen not get an all hazards insurance policy rather that incorporates flood, fire, everything you may need? Why are we having to go a la carte to a subsidized program from the federal government? And the program that I run is financially broken, and I'm asking Congress to fix it. It needs to be financially sound. And if they don't, then what I'm trying to do is invest in capital markets, look at capital markets with insurers to do reinsurance. I need the private insurance companies to help me absorb some of that risk. So I would say that because of that, with the reinsurance that we bought, during the 2017 season, we saved taxpayers about $1 billion. So, but when it comes to FEMA, the job is complex. Not only am I one of the largest insurers in the country, but I'm also responsible for continuity of government for the entire executive branch of government. The other lesson that we learned about infrastructure in this one is part of goal 2 is that our communications capability and backbone is incredibly fragile. It's not redundant, and yet you're being desensitized from a landline every day. You're being told you need this phone or that phone, and we're switching over to digital technology. Mm-hmm. And it was blown out in Puerto Rico, which caused us a lot of problems, and it was burned up in California. So when do we get with the private sector, the Verizons and the AT&Ts, to say, how do we do this in a more resilient and redundant fashion? Because the technology is changing so quickly that they have a tough time keeping up with it and have to, rebuild. It's expensive to rebuild at a mitigated standard. But here I am responsible for alerting every American of a missile threat or of the Amber Alert that occurred, in Denver and the area the other day. Those are systems that I operate.
That missile threat in Hawaii?
The missile threat in Hawaii is...
That was an interesting one.
That was also going on. They use our platforms for that. But when you look at the communications piece, and I'll tell you here's how complex Puerto Rico is in the infrastructure. And I'm going to ask you guys this question. You guys weigh in, because I'm going to put you in my spot for a second. You've got the oldest power grid, one of the oldest power grids on the globe. It's 44 years old. It's rotted and decayed to the point where the primary power plant that filters into San Juan was shut down because it was too unsafe to operate. They pumped their power out of Ponce, out of the south, over 4,000-foot mountains of rainforest, and they didn't do a very good job of maintaining it to get into San Juan. It's an incredibly fragile system, and the whole system breaks. Everything that you do has to be done basically by helicopter. You're literally dangling workers off of these helicopters to replace towers and attach lines and pulling them out of the rainforest. It takes a long time. The water system, the hospital system, everything is broken. But in the initial response, what was totally broken was the port system and the airports. And this is where the private industry can help me. When you get in, and there is no real port of entry, and you finally have the United States military get San Juan open, and you're trying to create, more ports of entry to get, goods into Puerto Rico, teams, good equipment in. It's like shoving a bowling ball down a straw. Okay, there's only so much bandwidth of all of those people that need to get in and the supplies that needs to get in. So because the air traffic control system was totally wiped out, we had to get the military to put up temporary air traffic control capability. I can talk one cargo plane in every 30 minutes. So here's my question to you. What do I put on that plane? Come on, guys, what do I put on there? Don't be shy. Water. Is that because CNN and Fox News and everybody's telling you it needs to be water?
Probably.
Is it water and food? What else? Medicine, medical supplies. What else? Generators. I can tell you who we were kicking off. But before I do that, you know how much money we spent on food and water and got to Puerto Rico? And where we get hit on, we didn't get food and water to Puerto Rico? That's not correct. We got $2 billion worth of food and water to Puerto Rico for that event. That would be FEMA's 14th most costly disaster in history. The problem is that the communication system was totally wiped out, that we couldn't message to people where to go to get the supplies. So if you want to hit me there. And the bottom line is you know who we were kicking off those planes that were dying to get in? Verizon, AT&T, and everybody else for the sake of food, water, and incident management team, hygiene kits, and generators. But what we really needed is, and we've got to rewrite specifically around infrastructure, the national response framework, and this is where the private sector comes in. I'm getting permission from the White House to rewrite the whole darn thing. when it comes to how we participate with the private sector in the infrastructure. We don't have systems that say in this situation, if you can get one plane every 30 minutes in, here's what you put on that plane. We don't have the systems and the capability of going, all right, there's thousands of Connex boxes that are sitting in those ports. What's in them that the private sector owns, but they can't move it because there's just no workers, there's no way to do it. But if they have food, water, hygiene kits, whatever they have in there, what's the supplies in those Connex boxes that I could have used? And I could have moved it and used it and reimbursed that private company for it. We're not that good. That's where the technology's got to go.
So I want to go back to this, where does the buck start here issue? Because it feels to me, given what you said and what President Trump said, and actually it's a lot that I've written about built vulnerability, people building in zones in Southern California that are fundamentally combustible, and planting. How many of you are from California and have planted a Canary Island date palm tree? Go on YouTube and look at what a flaming palm tree looks like. And how there are communities in Southern California where the community burned down, the palm trees exploded,
Yep.
Wind embers, and they rebuilt the communities and replanted the palm trees. Now, obviously, the federal government is not going to be the ban on palm trees in California. But I've yet to find a place in the country where the local community has the guts at the political level, and actually states. Jerry Brown is a great governor in many ways, but I've never heard him say during the fires, along with his focus on climate change, which is fine, but I never heard him say, we have to start building differently in fire zones. And one last thing, though, it's like this, even when the data are there, I wrote for ProPublica this piece, again, Headwaters Economics, free market, it's not liberal anything. They've been working with the Forest Service for years they have a free advisory for communities to living with wildfire, how to plan a community to live in a place that will burn someday. And there's 44 million households in the wildland urban interface or something like this. This is the area that can burn. 18 communities have taken them up on this. It's free. Yeah. So if the buck is not at the top and the buck is not in the local community, are we just stuck?
No, I mean, here again.
And tell me why not.
I always say preparedness is everybody's responsibility.
I know.
If you're waiting on FEMA to come in, that's a horrible plan.
But do we need a federal emergency mitigation agency too?
Well, we do mitigations. The problem is what we got to do is we need people to speak up to get Congress to change the laws that I have to deal with and operate with to get the money up front. There are some very aggressive bills, and I think that we're this close to doing it to where 6% of all the recovery dollars that we spend in public assistance would be put up mandatorily for pre-disaster mitigation. Well, if that goes through, then $2.5 billion becomes available from the Federal Emergency Management Agency next year for you to do whole community mitigation. Yeah. I don't know what's best for your community. You do. You don't want me dictating how to do community, stuff in your community, okay? And it can't be one-off mitigation plans. Who's got the data systems that says with $2.5 billion, these are the three areas, the three sectors nationwide we need to spend that money on to do the greatest good? First, to save lives, then two, to reduce property loss, okay? But when it comes back to the single greatest stuff about land use planning and everything else, one of the single greatest inventions that created the hurricane problem in this country was called air conditioning. Yeah, think about it. Look at the population of Florida after air conditioning was invented.
That's one of the chapters in my new book on the history of our relationship with weather and climate, 1902.
Yep, and then I hope you got a chapter in there about thermohaline circulation.
That's in there.
The primary driver of hurricane activity over multi-decadal periods, increased and decreased periods of 20 and 30 years, and we go through big oscillations in hurricane activity. And if you look at the last one, when Hurricane Camille hit in 1969. Research and scientists would say that we went about a 25 to 30 year period with less storms. So let's do the math on this. After 1969, between 1969 and 1995, when the faucet turned back on, name every hurricane you can right now. Go. Come on, guys. Katrina was 2005. From 1970 to 1995, name all the hurricanes you can. Andrew was one. Right, one of only 3 Cat 5s to ever make landfall since 1851, Andrew. Hugo, 89. All right. Now, from 1995 to today, name every hurricane.
Rita.
Right.
There you go.
I was making presentations when I was at Fema back the first time in early 2001, 2002, saying that the nation was about to pay for the lack of building codes in storm surge vulnerable areas and hurricane areas because of the process called thermohaline circulation. I also believe the climate's changing. What I don't understand is how is the climate changing impacting these huge cycles that oscillate, like El Nino and La Nina.
Yeah. You brought up one of the other moments in this history that I wrote is the human factor in weather disasters. So 2006, the New York Times, we were the only publication to cover this letter that came from, there were 10 climate scientists who were arguing in the literature and on Twitter. Well, actually not, Twitter hadn't quite started. They were arguing in the literature and online and blogs about how much global warming was playing a role in hurricanes. And this is from Judy Curry, who's a renowned skeptic. Some people are very critical of her, to Kerry Emanuel, who I first interviewed about hurricanes in 1988, so at MIT. So they were so worried that their legitimate scientific debate about global warming was distracting everybody. They wrote a letter together. They diverged completely. This is like that last session on finding room for agreement.
Yeah.
So they wrote, while the debate on the issue is of considerable scientific and societal interest and concern, meaning global warming and hurricanes, it should in no event detract from the main hurricane problem facing the United States, the ever-growing concentration of population and wealth in vulnerable coastal regions. They said, we're taking an eye, if you focus too much on, is this a yes-no climate change thing, you're missing completely the prime driver of danger, which is that.
Right.
So, but then where do you go from there?
Here again,
as a journalist, I've been wondering that question for a long
time. I believe the key to resilience right now exists at the local level. Trust me, FEMA every day is trying to figure out how to respond to these disasters. And
but is there a leadership role here? I mean, I'm not going to pick on Trump because I haven't seen any president make this case. A learning tour or a learning.
So I'll take that right there.
Yeah.
It does me no good to go to emergency management conferences. I'm glad to be here because I don't know who you are and what ideas you bring to the table or the capabilities. But if I go to emergency management conferences and preach to emergency managers, a lot of these folks don't really have a very strong voice to influence budgets and change laws and do things. They're great people, they're hardworking. We've got to change our audience. And so what I'm trying to focus on is changing my audience. I want to be here, but most recently, I went to the National Realtors Association. 20,000 people in this association. There's a realtor in every community. Hey, realtors, can you help me get people to understand the importance of national flood insurance program? Hey, asset poverty is killing me. It's killing you too because people can't go from a renter to a homeowner. And I also need you to help me change the NFIP policy because if Congress doesn't act by the 31st and reauthorize the program, then 40,000 home closures and sales will stop each month. Mm-hmm. So I'm reaching out to them. I want to reach out to them. I want to reach out to the insurance companies. It's got to be more grassroots. We got to get to education. When's the last time any of our kids, we've had basically 2 generations of people go through that never learned how to manage a checkbook. We're being desensitized to it.
Yeah.
And it's really hurting. And it's not just the household, but it's also the small business budgets where they don't have insurance. They don't write continuity of operations plans. They're very vulnerable. Because they have nothing to fall back on when it comes to having 3 to 6 months of just operational cash in an account. Too many Americans can't put their hands on $500.
And you mentioned disaster amnesia too as being another issue.
Yep, hurricane amnesia, disaster amnesia. Look, we went 11 years before this year. Here again, I'm the reason catastrophic disasters happen. But the last landfalling major hurricane that we had in this country was in 2005, Hurricane Wilma. We went 11 years without one. And Florida struck down its building code last year. The 2001 Florida building code was repealed, right? It was pulled back, which was exactly what we need.
So this, maybe the solution is community pressure on for you to be out there and or President Trump or someone to be out there.
We need to go back and verify
going to
that.
citizens, because there's that's come up over and over again. We're going to go to audience questions in a second. Well, actually, let's take one now. You can start.
Yes, ma'am.
Wait for a microphone. Say who you are, if you don't mind.
Hi, my name is Annalie Killian. I've recently moved to New York City and kind of concerned about disasters in a very, very densely urban population. My question is that I've not really noticed employers, taking this sort of localized action seriously in terms of potentially disaster mitigation other than the occasional fire alarm. How are you addressing employers in major megacities like New York City?
Well, so I don't necessarily address major employers. We try to put out a public awareness campaign like through Be Ready, and you can download the FEMA app. Download the FEMA app. It's got a ton of resources that are in there. But when it comes to employers, one, we're trying to instill that culture of preparedness, and it's just not occurring. I don't have the authority to make private industry do what needs to be done. And in some cases, and let me tell you, New York City is a coastal barrier island. It's very vulnerable to storm surge, which we saw from a tropical storm called Sandy, right? It's also a huge target. So I hand out billions of dollars every year to urban area security initiatives, the large cities like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles. I provide 98% of the grant funding that the whole entire Department of Homeland Security offers, out to those major UIC areas, what we call major cities, to help them buy equipment, to do training and exercise, to do all kinds of things. So we have a major footprint. Sometimes we can steer communities to push forward, but the biggest sector that's missing, as I said, are those four stools, the pillars of that the four pillars of that stool is the private sector and the non-governmental organizations. So the non-governmental organizations can do things because they're not bound by law. We've got to work with our non-governmental organizations of saying when Puerto Rico occurs or the California wildfires, don't duplicate the assistance that FEMA provides. Here's what I need you to do. And when it comes to the non-governmental organizations, how do we get them to do more pre-disaster mitigation rather than only being seen in the recovery realm? Get out there now and start educating people how to manage a checkbook, mitigate your house, be fire-wise in California or do whatever. And then when it comes to, we'll take the next question.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Before the next question, I'm going to intervene with one more. Moore, Oklahoma had this devastating tornado I wrote about in 2012. And they had two other, it's one of the unluckiest places, I hope no one here is from there, two other F5 tornadoes in its history. They put in a building code. Norman, Oklahoma, right nearby, hasn't. That's where the National Severe Storms Laboratory is. Studies. So this is the thing. Is there a way to foster crosstalk at the local? Is it a communication opportunity for me or others at which level that can make sure that it can spread that way?
The only thing that I can start to do on my end is really reduce the amount of grants that we give to communities that refuse to be that refuse to be mitigators. But I don't want to I don't want to hit people because they're not doing something. I want to set a target.
So it's like dog training, positive reinforcement.
And I'll give you an example. FEMA has tried in the past to build local and state community by demanding that you will do this. Well, it hasn't worked.
Yeah.
So how do we set forward a unified target? So the target for me is $41 million. Why $41 million? Anybody want to take a guess? $41 million. $41 million and less makes up 80% of the disasters that we declare and work. Okay? $7.5 million makes up 50% of the disasters that we declare. It's not a lot of money in my world, $7.5 million. But here's the deal. If I can set a goal that says for 41 million and under across this country in every state, if I grant you the money, can you manage the disaster response and recovery for that disaster? Okay? And we start setting a target collectively, and then if it doesn't work from there, then we start saying, hey, look, San Francisco is doing a lot to pass a building code. You get X amount of grant funding above those who are not. Or we start increasing the cost share on the disaster dollars on the back end. So I could start to say, quite honestly, if I wanted to make sure that state and local governments that are, quote, self-insured, which means we don't really have insurance because we know you will bail us out, FEMA. I can start raising the cost share from 75-25% to say, I don't know, 60-40 next year, and then 50-50 in 2 years, to where it's more beneficial for you and cost effective to have private insurance. I'm not ready to go there yet, but it's where we need to go. The private industry can solve a lot of those problems for us.
Okay, so let's go take 2 questions. We'll do in like 2 by 2 by 2. So.
Hi there, I'm Kathy Boffman-McLeod from Bank of America Merrill Lynch. And I think we might be cut from the same cloth, because I was in Washington State when Mount St. Helens blew, and then I moved to Florida and Hurricane Andrew came, and then the 0405.
So you're one of
You
these
want to join FEMA?
Yeah,
I'll send you to an exotic island.
Wow.
I've got some mudslides in there, some
Not Kilauea.
wildfire, got some sinkhole. There's a lot happening.
Yeah.
I wanted to, you talk about the cultural preparedness, or the building that culture, and make the analogy to the Dutch. And the Dutch manage water at this cellular level. If you are born in the Netherlands, 80% of your GDP is below sea level. They have a culture of preparedness, at least a culture of water management. When you think about those relationships you're building with the educational sector, and you're going to bring people up through society that understand culturally, not in pockets where everything's really terrible and they have amnesia. Is that where you're going? Are you thinking about, that's a big mandate for a federal agency, but I'm thinking about the Dutch and the way that they wake up every day and know how to manage water, and they do it.
So here again, when it comes to the cultural period, I'm very blessed. I grew up in a highly educated family in Charlotte, by the way, home of Bank of America, and north of Charlotte. And, I was very fortunate that I had a father that taught me a little bit about money, okay? Too many kids nowadays have never had that taught to them. So we could say, let's go put some more pressure on the Department of Education. And it's hard to come up with one curriculum that goes across evenly all 50 states, okay? It's hard because each state has their own curriculum standards and different things. It's very hard to do that. But what I can do is start with my own agency. So I'm drilling down, not only trying to spark the conversation, which I hope will exponentially increase as a result of being here today, but I'm drilling down through my own agency, because when the government shutdown occurs, I have several thousand employees living paycheck to paycheck that are worried about where they're going to go to pay their rent or get their next meal, and I need them ready to respond to you on your worst day. So what we've done is we formed a unique partnership with a non-governmental organization called Operation Hope. John O'Brien. He's formed with massive banks to start offering free counseling, educational counseling, to people that need it, period. It's just spreading the word. And then we brought them in. I had 2,000 to 3,000 employees attend his sessions, are getting set to the right path to understand how to get to the point where they're financially solvent themselves. Okay. So we're going to start with my own agency and drilling down, and then also try to spawn the conversation, which I hope it continues out.
Yeah, so now let's do what I was saying before, because we're running short on time. Let's get 3 short questions, and just get your point, and then we'll try to get some.
I have one comment and one question. I'm going to try to be really quick. My name is Amanda Rivera, and I'm from the Youth Development Institute of Puerto Rico. And my first comment is that civil society got together in Puerto Rico, and we just released a report on what to do to foster resiliency in Puerto Rico. So that work is actually done already, and I invite you to look at it. It's called Reimagine Puerto Rico. And then the second question is that in Puerto Rico, 60% of the FEMA applications have been turned down, or at least that's the data that we have. And so to what extent is one of the goals that you have of simplifying the process going to take care of that?
We'll do that. Yeah. Great.
So that's it.
2 more.
Thanks for still doing your job. The head of FEMA is often a political appointment, and many times they don't know what they're doing. You seem to really be on it, so congratulations. But A, should it be a political appointment? Secondly, the states are going to get money from the internet. Why not convene governors, mayors, and people have to be prepared for the disaster, and if you have one disaster, maybe, and you live in Mississippi on the river, maybe you shouldn't be getting bailed out the second time. Or if you're in Florida on the water, that's on you.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Hold that thought.
So two big things. Puerto Rico.
One more.
So I was there last week, and by the way, I am now the largest employer in Puerto Rico. Literally, I've hired 1,700 Puerto Ricans. I've got the best of what Puerto Rico has to offer, and Puerto Ricans are incredibly resilient. I think that the problem comes with decades of some tough government, right?
Oh, yeah.
The bottom line is that we're investing in Puerto Rico. When it comes to the applications process, 60%, I don't know what that is because there's numerous applications. The problem is that, we've registered 1 million people. Jay, how many people? 1 million people in Puerto Rico alone have received direct funding from FEMA, and then there's housing, and then there's rental assistance. Right now we're paying for funerals. We're doing all kinds of things that are there. So I don't know what that is, but just know that right now, in my opinion, Puerto Rico's got the best opportunity to be something incredible in the next 5 to 10 years with the amount of money that's coming in. But I'm being honest that I don't know how to use that funding to do that. And that's where we need to increase. So we will look into that. Yeah, absolutely. Now, thank you, ma'am. One thing I really appreciate is that I don't think there's ever been a tougher time to serve your country than now, period. I would ask that going forward, I got 21,000 dedicated people and many have been deployed for 50 weeks. They put their families aside to serve others. Please keep us out of the politics. Help us. If we're not doing something right, fair is fair. Call a spade, but understand the agency first before we just blindly throw out what's not working and blame FEMA. So I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Right here in the front, and then one more if we can fit it right there.
Yeah, just quickly, the question is, does FEMA too often become the scapegoat? And an example, U.S. Forest Service gets $100 million a year in aerial firefighting suppression budget. They're confined by their budget. If they had $200 million, then they could put fires out more quickly before them getting bigger, and then you end up paying for it because they get out of control. So is FEMA too often the backstop?
Yep, so I go back to the first original question, what do you want me to be good at? Because it's not the Federal Electricity Management Agency. Right. I'm rebuilding a power grid in Puerto Rico, it shouldn't be us, but here's why. It's not the DOE, the Department of Energy doesn't want to do it. They don't have the legislative authority or the budget to do it. It's with me. I'm also not a housing expert, but I can tell you that I put we collectively have coordinated over 5 million nights in hotels for people that have lost 5 million nights of hotel stays. I pay a $3.5 million a day hotel bill to put Americans in hotels that have lost their homes. We live in the greatest country on the globe, the amount of stuff that's there. But when it comes to fixing the problem holistically, I'm not the expert in housing. There's a whole other agency for that. They don't have the legislative authority and the budget to do it. So FEMA gets put into this position and is often the one to point the blame.
And the firefighting budget at Forest Service actually ends up rating into the prevention budget at Forest Service, which is you want it flipped. What was the figure you said? The value of preventive work?
6 to 1. $1 spent in pre-disaster mitigation will save $6 on the back end. It's a no-brainer. We just got to get Congress to change the laws and do more pre-disaster mitigation.
The incentives are upside down.
Yeah.
So we have one question. 1 minute. So what keeps you up at night? I got to tell you, I was at a meeting on.
I don't. I go home and get in the fetal position.
Oh, so you don't sleep? That's good, right?
No.
No, I was at a meeting in Costa Rica on Zika, and journalists were saying, "How do we don't know how to cover this issue." And while I was there, I looked at the World Health Organization's list of priorities things, and it has this long list of things, Zika, blah 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 blah, and it has disease X, which disease X is the one we don't know yet.
Pandemic events, anything on the public health side. Truly scares me because I can tell you where I've been. If I was patient zero, last week I was in the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, then Boston at Harvard. And then I went back home to Charlotte and then came to Denver yesterday, and now I'm here. That's within a matter of days. I'll go back to DC tomorrow. Who knows where I'll be tomorrow.
So don't go.
When it comes to public health and the way to deal with public health, it's going to be a major, drain. And with the drop ship commodity, like the drop shipping Amazons of the world, I have an authority that's incredibly important. It's called the Defense Production Authority, to where I can stop everything in the market and buy what I need to put it to work. So, for example, I can stop all sales on a manufactured home and buy every one in the country before you can. what I got to figure out is how I can do that with Amazon to say if there's personal protective equipment or hygiene equipment that's going across the globe, how do I use that authority to put a halt on all of it and get what we need?
Ask the
And
richest
then
man in the
I'm going to
world.
have a bunch of other countries yelling at me for doing it.
Right.
And so I'm not going to do that, but we have to have dialogue. I mean, the global dialogue's not there. But yeah, pandemic events keeps me up at night.
And Cascadia. That keeps you
Cascadia
up.
and the New Madrid, Cascadia, Wasatch, the low to no notice earthquake, guys, I'm telling you, we need mitigation there, smart building, retrofitting. A lot of money's got to go into the retrofitting. And I almost wonder how we give each house in this country a risk score. If you want to live in paradise, there's a price to pay. If you want to live in a rift zone at the most active and largest volcano, there's a price to pay.
That's for sure. Well, thank you. Thank you heaps for doing your work. Good luck going forward.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.